there, welcome to Board Game Hot Takes, the podcast where we give our immediate reactions to the hottest board games just minutes after playing them. My name is Tim.
And this is Chris.
This is Adam.
And today, instead of talking about a game we just finished playing, we're going to talk about the best and worst combat mechanisms. We're going to list our top 3 combat mechanisms used in games, but we're also going to talk about a couple combat mechanisms that just didn't hit for us, that we want to pick a fight with. We'll get into that in just a minute, but I do have some poll results here. This is a pretty straightforward poll, but I was kind of curious about how our listeners, who are they playing with right now? And so I asked the question on Twitter, how many people do you play board games with most frequently? And the options I gave were 1, I fly solo, 2 players, 3 to 4, or 5 plus. And the main reason I was kind of curious about this, especially through this pandemic and stuff, are people just playing with their significant other primarily, or are they playing solo a lot? Do they have a small group they're getting together with? So there's not a lot of commentary on this because obviously it's not like a discussion heavy topic here, but I was curious about the results. Well, how did you guys answer this?
Tim, I was looking for an answer on this one, and you didn't have it. Should it be a fractional person? 2 and I'm just kidding.
Adam was looking for some way to deviate from your options, and it was hard.
There's no way you didn't answer this one right.
Trying to avoid a direct answer here. Couldn't do it. The answer is 4. It's you guys. That's the main group I have to play with. I love it. Games at 4 are fantastic. Sometimes we drop down to 3. That's where all the best games happen for me. 3 to 4 players is just fantastic. So I'm happy with that. That's my answer. What about you, Chris?
My answer was the same. It's 3 to 4. It's mostly with you guys, but recently I've got a couple of small groups that I've been gaming with that usually end up also being 3 to 4 people, often including my wife. So we do play some games one-on-one, my wife and I, but the majority of the time it ends up being with a couple of other people. And so between that and what I do with you guys is 3 to 4, which is great because that is the sweet spot where I think a lot of these games really shine.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think 3 to 4 is like the perfect player count for most games. And so that's my ideal game night. If I can have 3 to 4 players getting together, any more than that, and there's fewer games you can play, any less than that, and it just takes a little bit of the interaction and the kind of the chatter around the table away. So I love playing at 3 to 4 players. I also answered 3 to 4, but this was a really hard one for me, and I didn't look up, I don't track statistics on how many people I'm playing with when I'm recording my plays, so I don't know this for sure, but I counted our weekly game night, which is always 3 to 4. I've been playing with a couple local groups that are 3 to 4. My wife and our friend Jen, usually 1 to 2 games a week, so that's at 3 players. So I think that's got to be the number. I think if it had been 2 months ago, I probably would have said solo was probably my number 1 player count. But with more activity on BGA, I tend to find some of my evening, if I've got a little free time, I'm typically taking some turns on BGA instead of going up to my game table and playing some solo games. So I think I'm doing a little less solo lately. So probably 3 to 4 is my answer as well.
What's your guys' ideal situation? So I'll answer this with an example for me. So say I show up to an area and maybe there's like 7 or 8 people there. So if we want to play some big, crazy game, Sidereal Confluence, or Dune or something like that, there's enough people to make it happen. But, if you want to branch into smaller groups too, then you got enough people to go, 2 tables of 4 players or whatever. Do you guys have a perfect game count scenario that you'd be looking for?
Yeah, almost every time, if there was 7 to 8 players, I would say, hey, let's break into 2 tables of 3 to 4. Like, that's the perfect time. 5's hard because then you got 1 2-player game, which is usually going to be a little quicker and lighter, and then a 3-player game, and it feels like the 2-player group doesn't get the same experience that the 3-player group does. If you had 6 though, 6 is usually going to be break into 2 3-player groups. 8 almost definitely. There are a few games that I really like at 6 players, and those can be a lot of fun. So maybe like it's starting out the game night with like, hey, let's all play up this 45-minute game of Jamaica. AuZtralia is probably a great game to jump in and start a game night with, but then let's break into 2 3-player midweight Euro games. That's the way for me to go.
Yeah, same for me. I absolutely say 3 to 4 players regardless of how many are available. I can't think of a single game that I'd rather play with 5 or more than 3 to 4.
Well, Twitter seems to agree with us here. 1 player was only 5%, 2 player was 40%, so it's a pretty decent amount, but 3 to 4 player was 50%. and then 5 plus was 5%. I was kind of suspicious whether 2 players would be the majority there, just because it's easy. You know, if you got a significant other that you game with, sometimes you're going to get the most games that way. I do, but like my wife and I think we have more fun when we're gaming with other people. Like if it's just the two of us playing a game, we do once or twice a week, we'll typically sit down and play a game. My wife is way more competitive when it's a 2-player game, and she gets more frustrated if she's losing or something doesn't go her way. We play a 3 or 4-player game and she just seems to have a good time and doesn't care. So I don't even ask for 2-player games most of the time now. I prefer just to play with her when we're playing with other friends. So for me, that's not the way to go. But I think there are some, gaming couples where they can get a lot of games in.
That's interesting. I wonder why that is. Is it that it becomes it's a game event when she's playing with you? It's a social event when she's playing with you and others.
I think so. I don't know. Maybe she's just putting on a facade for our friends and she doesn't. Maybe she's still just as mad when she loses in those situations. I don't know. So let's move on to our favorite and least favorite combat mechanisms. This is a topic we've been kind of chatting a little bit about as we've played some different games. There are some really interesting and unique ways to deliver combat in a game. We finally got around to dedicating an episode to it. I'm curious, did you guys have any standards that you set when you were picking this? Like when I was looking at some of my favorite combat mechanisms, there were a few that almost made the list, and I might mention them at the end of the episode as honorable mentions, but these were combat mechanisms where it was combat against the game itself. Combats where it wasn't just players against each other. There's a combat happening, but it's happening against monsters in the game or something like that. So I chose to exclude those. I only focused on interactive multiplayer combats where you're actually interacting with the other players at the table. Did you guys set any rules for yourselves around this?
So not necessarily rules for me. I did think about Spirit Island, Tim. So that's kind of one, like you were saying, where the people are fighting against the system, the board game system. So the system generates these invaders and cities and towns, and you have to figure out how to destroy them in Spirit Island. And it's pretty cool. You use your deck and deck management. Yeah, I didn't bring it into my list because I thought of a combat system as people versus people. And I didn't necessarily think of it when I was making the list. I just excluded it because it didn't feel right. What about you, Chris?
I did the same thing that Tim did. I excluded ones where you're fighting against the game. And a good example of that, I almost included Lords of Hellas, that has a combat mechanism where you're fighting monsters and you get to, based upon the cards you have, apply hits of different types to a monster. A monster might require a certain type of, like a blunt instrument hit or a sword hit or something like that, or a ranged weapon hit. And it's a neat mechanism, but I guess it didn't feel like that felt in the spirit of what we were talking about. This is more of a head-to-head kind of thing, and so I did the same.
That's great. That's a great example, Chris. I hadn't even thought about that one, but that's a great one. And I'll probably mention a couple again as backup options at the end of the episode, where I talk about a couple others where I like it when you're fighting against the game and they do a good job with combat. Let's jump into our list here. I usually don't start out the list, so I'm going to shift things up and I'm going to start out the list with my number 3 favorite combat mechanism. My list is probably going to be a little different than yours, is that I'm more of the kind of Euro player, the resource management player. So I've got a couple combat mechanisms that are used in what would be more traditional Euro type of games versus heavy conflict games. I'm interested to hear what you guys think, whether you would actually consider these as combat mechanisms. But for me, I felt like they hit the mold. My number 1 is Dwellings of Eldervale. So Dwellings of Eldervale is a Luke Laurie design released by Breaking Games in 2020. And this is a big, epic Euro game where you're collecting resources, but you're also fighting other players on the board. You're fighting monsters and things like that. And the game is a little bit rules heavy, a little too much going on for what you get out of the game for me to really love the game. But one of the things I do really like about it is the combat mechanism here. The way the combat works is that if you move into a space with a different player's characters, whether it's their workers or it's one of the monsters that are on the board, then a combat's going to happen at the end of that round. A couple things can happen before the combat starts is that other players can then, if they're in adjacent spaces, they can move their workers in. And every type of work you've got kind of counts for a different number of dice you're going to be rolling. So your main workers are usually going to be 1 dice. Your warriors are going to be 2 dice. If you have a dragon in there, it's going to be 3 dice. And if a monster moves in, it could be rolling 4 to 5 dice. But what's cool, a couple of things I really like about it. One is that it's really quick to resolve. So after you make that quick decision about who else is joining the combat, you just take the number of dice that you're going to be using, and everybody rolls these, handfuls of dice. Somewhere between 1 and 6 dice are going to get rolled on the table. And the way the combat gets resolved is that you look at the top dice. And if it's a 6 and you're the only one with the 6, you just won the combat. Super easy. But if two people have a 6 and you look at the next lowest number, maybe it's a 4. Oh, 2 people have a 4, but the third person, he's out of the conflict. We don't even need to look at theirs anymore. So then you look at the next one below that. So it resolves really quickly, but it's fun. You know, you've got some odds going in there. The more dice you roll, the better odds you have. But you get these big epic moments where there's a monster in there with 5 dice, and this one little worker is in there with 1 dice, and you roll that, and he gets the 6, and the monster gets 4 5s or something like that, and you just won it. And so it can result in these big, exciting moments. Usually it doesn't, right? You're playing by the odds, but it definitely can happen. And then there's a couple other cool things that happens. There are some cards, magic cards that you can play out of your hand during the conflict that might switch a dice after the dice numbers have come up. It can add another dice to it. So I like when you can add some surprises into a combat. You know, you're going in there thinking you're going to win it, but you don't know what the other person has in their hand. And then one last thing I'll mention is that both the winners and the losers get some benefits. And it's not super impactful, right? It's a Euro game. So you don't want to lose your game because somebody moved into your space. You will get pushed out of that space. Maybe you don't get the opportunity to build a dwelling that time, which can be painful, but you get to go to the underworld and then you're going to get some swords. So you at least get some benefit for losing. And then the winners get a commensurate benefit. They've got that control of that space, but they also get to move up on this hero track. It's just a great combination of the combat moves quick. It's fun to me. It's exciting moments. And that's what I like in conflict and combat in games.
So as you're discussing these, and one of the things that crossed my brain while I was making this list too, is when you're rolling these dice, the probabilities that you're going to get what you think you're going to get. So in other words, the variance that goes in with this. So maybe you're statistically likely to roll a 10, also a 9 and 11, same thing with 8 and a 12. But then it goes it juts sharply down to go any further away from a 10 than that. In other words, what are the odds that you're going to get some kind of horrible random roll versus what you are statistically likely to get? As I was making this list, I preferred the ones with a lot less variance that weren't so chaotic and random. So that was just kind of a neat thought when you talked about that system. I didn't really consider, what the variance is with that kind of system.
Yeah, and the key here is absolutely, one of the problems with combat mechanisms is that when you just lose the luck, and we talked about this a little bit last week on one of our episodes. Why Dwellings of Eldervale works is that the negative is not that big of a deal. It doesn't break the game for you. Versus Eclipse, you go into a conflict and have a bad roll, and you could be out of the game. And you know it, and you're going to be sitting there for another hour playing, just trying to claw your way back to a second or third place. But in Dwellings of Eldervale, you lose a conflict, who cares? It's not a big deal, but sometimes you get that exciting moment where you knocked out the monster, you get to move up an elemental track, and it just got you this big win, which again isn't going to break the game, but it's a fun, exciting moment. And that's why it works. When you've got that huge randomness, it doesn't make that much of a difference in the game.
You're kind of disparaging towards the combat and Eclipse there. I feel like we're going to hear more about that later on.
Adam, your discussion of probabilities there makes me wonder if you've modified your Azul spreadsheet for this.
That's one of the separate tabs. I've got different tabs for each of the games, and they're normal curve for each situation. So it's pretty awesome.
I dig your style.
All right, Adam, well, why don't you jump in with your number 3 favorite combat mechanism?
Thanks, Tim. I will. Let me get my 2 pages of notes out, like I always have for these top episode lists. Very prepared and organized and ready to go. And I kind of organized this by what I thought was the most interesting to discuss. So number 3 is Inish. That's by Christian Martinez and Matago Games. So the way combat works here, they're called clashes. And if there's people of different clans in the same spot, you guys can have a clash. Or you can just decide not to. You talk with the guys at the table. Do you want to clash? No, I don't want to clash either. Let's just hang out and have a good time. No one wants to fight here. So that's the first step of the whole thing. But if somebody wants to decide to instigate an attack, it's going to go in turn order, round and round and round. The first person decides to attack with a draw or play an epic tale card. If you want to attack, you just pick who you want to attack. The defender decides to either remove one of their members from that territory, or they can discard an action card. So hand size has a lot to how you're going to do in combat, in addition to the number of your members of your faction in that territory. Instead of deciding to attack somebody, you can decide to withdraw, pull out of there, save your stuff. Or you can play one of these epic tale cards like I was saying. It might do something crazy. So that's one thing too. You see that somebody else might have one of these red cards with this amazing art on it, by the way. And these are very situationally dependent, but if you engineer the situation just right, you can play one of these epic tile cards and make something crazy happen and help you meet that win condition. The combat goes like that, round and round and round, until you decide to stop fighting, and then it's over. You guys have thoughts on the combat here, or what do you think of the combat in Inish?
Yeah, this game is so interesting. First of all, hearing you talk about it reminds me how clever the game is, but also some of the frustrations with it. And I almost consider putting Inish on one of my least favorite combat mechanisms, mainly because you get into a conflict with another player, and ultimately what you either end up doing is walking away or dumping your entire hand. All these cards that you draft that round, you're dumping, right? And that's so painful. And especially in like a 3-player game where all of a sudden now 2 people have just dumped their entire hand of cards for one space on the board, and now there's one player that's just going to get to do all kinds of stuff on there. I don't know, I don't love that, but at the same time, it's pretty fun, tough decisions to make. So I think this is a game we should probably go back to, play with the expansion, which is supposed to fix some of the king-making issues with it and some of the other challenges that I had with it. I think it's a cool game, and I think you know, like listening to how the combat goes there makes me want to go back and try it again. It's a game that I'm definitely conflicted on. I don't know whether I love it or I hate it. Maybe I do fall somewhere in between, but it definitely pushes me in both those directions every time I play it. So, interesting one. What about you, Chris? What do you think of Inish combat?
Honestly, I don't even remember. I don't remember the combat in that other than what just Adam just described. That's never been a game that I've ever been very into. That's one of those ones that is so beloved, and yet I've never quite understood the attraction to it. So, I mean...
Kind of like Gaia Project, Chris?
Anyway, no, that's... I don't remember it making a huge impact on me either way, quite honestly.
Yeah, all right. Chris, what's your number 3? Wow us with your amazing number 3 combat mechanism here.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to wow you or not, but... Well, first of all, this is a discussion that's really close to my heart, because I love big fights, and I cannot lie. This is definitely, I mean, this is historically my favorite type of game. The ones that have big production usually also have big battles. I mean, that's just kind of how games tend to be. And so it's a lot of fun going back and doing a review of all the games that we played and figuring out which ones had the best combat mechanisms, because that's truly one of those things where a game can live or die by how good its combat mechanism works. And that is the God's honest truth. It can make or break a game. So, getting back to the topic at hand, my number 3 was a game that we actually didn't like very much, but I really did enjoy the combat in it. And that was Fractal Beyond the Void, which is a Kickstarter that I don't believe has delivered yet. I think it's still in production. But the way that combat worked in that game, it was relatively complex. There were different kinds of troops on the map. There were ground forces, there were heavy ground forces, there were air forces and heavy air forces, and there were also different technologies that you could use to enhance each of those different types of forces. And then when a combat occurred, you took your hand of cards, there was 5 or 6 cards, and each player started with had the same cards. You would go around in rounds where each player in the combat would throw down a card. Now, each of the cards had tactics on it. There was, for example, a strafing run. I'm making this up, but for example, something like a strafing run where air troops could attack ground troops, or anti-aircraft, which would be the opposite kind of thing. And there were cards that let you do things like retreat, but kill troops on your way out of the combat. And so you keep doing that until the combat was resolved. And it was incredibly engaging if you were in that combat. And it was complex, and it was a game of cat and mouse because you generally knew what cards were out there. And so you had an idea of both what card would be most effective for your opponent, but also whether they had that in their hand or not. And I really enjoyed that part of it. But the reality is that complexity also made it kind of a grind if you weren't involved in that combat. Like I remember, I can't remember who said it, was one of you guys commented on that. Yeah, it was probably Tim, who commented on that during the review, that if you weren't in the combat, you were sitting there twiddling your thumbs, going to get a beer, using the bathroom, whatever, and being bored. If you were in the combat, it was great. But if you weren't in the combat, then it was a grind and not a whole lot of fun. So the good side on that is there's a lot of agency, a lot of really interesting decisions to be made in cat and mouse in the actual combat between the players. The downside, the complexity just made it made it too much of a slog for those who weren't involved in the fight.
That's a great example, Chris. And I think that the combat is really interesting there. I think there's going to be another example coming up today that does something similar, but I think a little bit better than Fractal did. But I think it was a really cool combat mechanism, even if I did feel like it was a little slow moving as an outsider with it. And that reminds me, that game had some pretty neat things going on. I kind of like to check that one out again at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's when I ended up not backing on Kickstarter. I pulled out largely because of, I think we played that and we played Voidfall. And I think we played Eclipse shortly after that too in one of our own game nights. And I just was reminded of how much I love Eclipse. But I went back and I'm looking at some updates now from Fractal because talking about it, I was like, yeah, I wonder if they've done any more on it. And they have. The developers are putting a lot more info. They keep updating Board Game Geek as well as their Kickstarter campaign of just little minor tweaks they're doing. And it sounds like it's getting better every iteration. So although I haven't backed it, I'm definitely keeping my eye on this one. I'll be very interested to see the final product. There's a lot of potential in this game.
Agreed.
So my number 2 was Dune, a game of conquest and diplomacy, which has to take the winner for the worst name of a game ever made. Because they could have just named it like Dune Revisited or Dune Reduced or something interesting like that, something quick and simple that still differentiates from the original Dune game. But they went with Dune, a game of conquest and diplomacy, which is impossible to add to a podcast episode name. It just takes up too much space.
It's also hard to remember what the two things are. So you're like, was it Dune, a game of magic and espionage? Or
exactly.
What was that again?
Name notwithstanding, this was supposed to be a simpler version of the original Dune game from the 70s, which is a big epic game. You're on Arrakis trying to control different areas and you're trying to form alliances with other players and work together. And a game that just sounded like a miserable slog to me of too much time, too much working with other players, too much randomness in the game. So this was the streamlined version of it. It plays under an hour, and we reviewed it and had a great time with it. I did anyway. I really enjoyed this game, but my favorite part of the game was the conflict, the combat in it. And the combat was the whole game, really, right? Like, if I remember right, as you're taking your turn, the round is essentially like put some troops on the map, and if any troops end up together, then you go to conflict. And the conflict was the big event of every round, and I had a blast doing it. I think that this is similar to the original Dune. I'll let Adam jump in on this after I finish explaining it, but the way that it works is essentially everybody has a little combat dial. When you go to conflict, you're going to set your combat plans, which is hidden information. Nobody else knows what you're setting on this thing. So there's a combat dial that you set, can be a maximum of the number of troops you have in the conflict, but you might want to set it lower because whatever you commit as far as troops go, then you're going to lose those at the end of the conflict. Then you also add a leader, and every player has some different leaders that have different numbers on them. Like you might have 1 through 5, or one faction might have like 2 through 6, or if you've lost leaders earlier in the conflicts or earlier in the game, you might only have a few numbers left. But basically, you're going to pick one of these numbers and you're going to add it to the conflict. And that leader is going to add to whatever the combat dial score you have is. But there's a little surprise going on because you also get to set a weapon card and a shield card if you have them in your hand. These are like hidden cards that nobody else would know, and nobody knows whether you're going to play them. But basically, the weapon card might say, you're going to send a
Chris knife
for a laser gun.
Yeah, like a Chris knife or whatever. But anyway, so there's different types of conflict. So you could use a Chris knife on there, which would be direct hand-to-hand combat. But if the opposing player had played a shield that said protects against hand-to-hand combat, then that Chris knife wouldn't do anything. But if they didn't have that shield, then your leader would be killed before it counted for the combat points. So you don't know whether your leader is going to actually count towards the points in the combat. So there's a little bit of like brain games of like, well, he's got that big leader left, so I want to use this weapon, but I also know that he drew a bunch of cards, so maybe he's got some shields for it. And then there are some mechanisms some factions can kind of like control. They can have visibility into what people are playing and stuff like that. So it's a really fun decision about what to set as the plan here. And the other big thing that's kind of cool here is that if you manage to kill the opponent's leader in this conflict, then you get spice equal to the leader's power as well, which is huge. It's kind of what runs the whole economy of the game. So that is just such a big event. It's so much fun. It's such a mind game. The different factions control those combats in different ways that make it an interesting puzzle every time you're playing it. And It's great. I just love it. And because the game's short, like listen, if you had this kind of random decision process that could completely throw your game in a 6-hour game or a 3-hour game, I would hate it. But because it's played in like 45 minutes and that's what the game is, it's so much fun to go in there and just like hope that you win this conflict. And when it works out, it's great. And you get to do all these, make these little plans and then put it together. And even watching the other players at the table get into these conflicts was a blast for me, because it's just such a fun resolution of like, oh, we both revealed, okay, he shot a dart at this guy. Oh, but he's got the shield to block the dart, so he's going to hit him with the crysknife. Oh, that leader's out, but he's still got more troops than the other guy. You know, like it's just such a fun puzzle. And just because that is the game, to me, that was one I had to call out as one of my favorite combat mechanisms.
Tim, one of the greatest parts about this combat to me that you left out is the other person might have that traitor card of the leader that you play.
You're right. I totally left it out. Yep.
So you can bust that out there. Maybe you're down 3 to 20 in strength, but then you have the traitor card for that leader. That means all their entire team dies. You don't lose anything. You collect all this stuff and you win. That's right. It's such a great moment. It happens just rarely enough that when it does happen, it's this big event. The whole table blows up. Oh my gosh, you had the traitor. That's crazy. So that is just another piece of tension to that great Dune combat.
I love that you brought this one up, Tim, because that is such a fun mechanism. It easily could have made my list as well, and I completely agree. I also agree with what Adam just said, because that was one of the things. It was a dynamic that I thought really changed how you went about combat. So, for example, I remember there was at one point, I forget which of you guys it was, but I had 2 or 3 of the traitor cards for your faction, whoever it was. And so I felt pretty confident going into combat with that person because I had a whole bunch of their traitor cards. As I recall, it didn't actually work out in my favor that time, but the idea was really cool. It's a really neat way to do it.
Yeah, super exciting. I love that. So Adam, what's your number 2 combat mechanism?
Let me grab my notes again. My number 2 was from The Battle for Rokugan. That's a game by Molly Glover and Tom Jolly on Fantasy Flight Games. This game is just a gorgeous looking game, first of all. It's all kind of watercolory, set in this, I think it's an IP that I'm not familiar with at all. But anyway, there's five or maybe 6 turns in this game, and you start out, you draw a batch of tokens from your token pile, from your chit pile, like a samurai situation, Chris. But it's nothing like samurai from this point on, so you will love this one. I know it. The types of chits here, there's an army guy that has a number on it. There's a blessing token that you put that on top of one of your other chits that adds 2 to it. There's a diplomacy one, a shinobi one, a raid one, a naval. Anyway, players take turns putting these 6 tokens out on the map, and you're either putting them in the center of a territory that you control, which will add to the defense to it, or maybe it's a diplomacy. Maybe you guys are just going to drink tea this round and no fights in there. Or you're putting these tokens on the border of a territory, and that's kind of an attack, a threatening one. And there's this other token, the shinobi, who's like a black ops team. He can go to any territory out there in the game, and you can plop them down. Also, there's the navy ones. They can go on any coastal territory to either defend or attack in the same way. Attack if you put it on the border, defend if you put it within the border in the province you control. So it's neat. You do this whole little setup, and everybody's got their tokens out there. There's mind games. Why did Chris put his token right in the middle of my province? What's he gonna do? And what's he doing over here? Is he attacking? Is that a bluff? There's also a bluff token, so you can just put that wherever you want, and you start playing these head games. Then it comes to the reveal. Everybody flips their tokens over, and the battle's all resolved. You count up the numbers. Wait a minute, I have a card. I can counter that. Boom, get rid of this token. That thing's gone. So there's a little bit of card playing here. There's this reveal. There's this bluffing. After you resolve the battles, if you have a certain amount of territories in this region, then you get the little battle card, the little special card that gives you a bonus for next round or something that you get to do in the next battle. And that's pretty much the game. 5 or 6 rounds of that, whatever it is. And then you're all set. So that's just a super interesting one. Battle for Rokugan. I want to get this game in front of you guys and see what you guys think.
Yeah, this is a game we have not had a chance to play with you, Adam. And this is one of the games, I think one of my bigger regrets from TimCon was that you've talked it up before. It sounded pretty interesting, and we did not get a chance to play it. This seems interesting. We should check it out, and we'll tell you why you're wrong.
It's a skinny little box. It's easy to take on an airplane, so
Excellent.
I'll bring it with me next time we're all hanging out.
Cool. Sounds good. All right, Chris, what's your number 2?
My number 2 was Eclipse, Second Dawn for the Galaxy, which makes me feel a little bit like I'm stealing some of Adam's thunder, because he is really the founder of the feast as far as that game goes. He introduced us to it, and it has been a blast every time we've played it. But to go into the combat a little bit, the way it works is it's pretty traditional dice rolling, but 2 really significant twists to it. One is that each vessel that's involved in a fight can take so many hits. And you have to hit that many times in order to knock it out. And then you go on to other vessels and try to knock those out as well. The other twist is that the dice are all different. The dice you use to roll against your opponent are dependent upon the technologies that you've built into your ships. So there are some basic, something like laser guns that give you a certain number of pips on each side that are hits or not hits. And then there's other ones that include multiple hits on multiple sides of the die, so you have a really excellent chance of hitting. There's even this one thing called the Rift Cannon, which gives you an excellent chance of hitting, but also bears a pretty significant risk of hurting yourself. In other words, it's this really unstable weapon that does a lot of damage, but can also damage you as well. And so you go into your battle knowing how many ships you've got and how many dice you're going to be able to roll, and understanding the benefit and the power of the dice that you have. So you have a lot of agency there, but in the end, you're ultimately rolling dice to see whether or not you win. And you can have the strongest force in the galaxy, and you can still lose because you roll some really crappy dice. Now, it doesn't generally happen that way, and you can also add cards that are technology to your ship, computers, shot computers, that increase the number on your die so that you can almost guarantee yourself a hit. But those are things you have to affirmatively do. So what I like about Eclipse is that it does give you that high level of agency, because you are essentially controlling what dice are going to be available to you, what they're capable of, how they work, how many there are as you go into a combat. But it still leaves the possibility of the big, exciting dice roll. And I think that's one of the themes of combat that we're talking about here, is the degree to which luck plays a role in the combat. There is a downside of it that nobody likes getting slammed by a roll of bad dice. But there's also an upside of it that there's a big reveal, and that's kind of exciting. And so I think Eclipse does a really nice job of balancing those two things in a way that it occasionally can feel really brutal and unjust, but generally feels like an understandable outcome of a battle based on the way that it was set up by the two parties. And I think that's a real success, especially for a game with a lot of dice rolling.
Chris, I love the combat here in Eclipse. It's so tense. You're rolling those dice. Just having those dice in your hand and shaking them and putting them out there after building your ships the whole game and getting the odds to where you want them to be. I love it. This is one of the games where I feel like the curve, the variance on what you're expecting versus the probable outcomes is narrow, and I like that. You know, you can kind of predict what's going to happen, and there's a good chance that that's actually going to happen. Now, I will say that roll in the Chris versus Tim battle, where Tim just got all blanks and Chris got all hits, amazing. Like, what were the chances? Apparently, the chances were 100%. But something like that, we're going to remember that moment forever, because it was so unlikely to happen. It was just one of the worst / best die rolls I've ever seen in my entire life. So,
and it had the gunpowdery scent of justice.
Tim, I know you have thoughts on Eclipse here.
I have a lot of thoughts on this game. And first of all, I do think it's actually a brilliant system. It's one of the least approachable combat systems I've ever seen in a game. And the first game that I ever played of it, I had no idea what was going to happen in combat. I rolled my dice and I let Adam figure out what was going to happen with him. Here's the deal, right? So you build up this ship, which is really the root of what's really unique and spectacular about Eclipse, is that you get to kind of build the blueprints for your ship and create this unique ship that you've got, this fleet that you've got. But when you go to conflict, you have a couple things that are happening, right? Chris already talked about the different dice, basically the different types of weapons you can put on your ship, which are going to give you different types of dice and different amounts of dice. But also, you've got the hull on your ship, which is going to potentially, if you get hit, it will protect you from actually dying. And then you've got shields and computers. So computers increase the odds of you hitting a ship, but they're countered out by shields. And so that's the only reason for having those. Normally, you would only get hit with a direct hit. If you have a computer, then it lets you hit with a 5 or a 6 instead of just a 6. But the shield counters that out. It gets really easy as you play the game a little bit more to kind of translate what all is happening there. But in a first game, it's like, okay, first we have to calculate how much computer he's got. And then, okay, so these are the dice that are going to hit. Oh, but he's got a shield, so that's going to counter that out. Okay, he did get hit. Wait, but he's got a hull, so he doesn't take a damage yet. So it's like this whole, huge decision tree that has to happen for you to actually understand who just won that conflict. That said, once you get to know the system, it's really cool. And that's kind of, again, it's the core of building up the blueprints on your ship and making the ship what it is. And so you have to have these different components that make it worthwhile to have good decisions there. It's one of the games where you can control the odds. You can build up a fleet that's going to be amazing and block anybody. And then you can hit a bad dice roll, which in some games wouldn't be the end of the world to be exciting. But in this game, if you get a bad dice roll, if you have a bad conflict, you can just completely be knocked out of the game. The game's fun. It's great, but it definitely, for me, it has those really, really rough moments where, oh man, I just knocked Chris's entire fleet out, and I feel bad for him because he's going to be sitting there with one little ship on his fleet and his one little control token there for the next half an hour while we play the last 3 rounds of the game. So that's the only issue with it, but otherwise, very cool system.
So Tim, what's your number 1?
So my number 1 is, believe it or not, I'm not a Dune fanboy because I'm going to mention another Dune game here. But my number 1 game is Dune Imperium. And Dune Imperium is one of my favorite games from the last decade. Definitely my favorite game from 2020. And I think we talked about it on last week's episode, but with the latest expansion, maybe my favorite game of all time. I think it's sitting right on the fringe there, and we'll see how that falls over the next year. But Dune Imperium has a really interesting combat system because it's not really like any other combat system. This, again, is a kind of a Euro game, where you're just placing workers, collecting resources. But at the end of every round, there's a conflict phase that's going to happen. And there's a bunch of things I like about this. First of all, that some of the worker placement spaces that you take determine whether you're putting troops into this conflict. And that is unique in and of itself. You're giving up other resources to get into this conflict. But why are you doing that? This is one of the things I love about the conflict. There is an interesting and varied reward for every conflict at the end of every round. You only have to get 10 points to win this game. And one of the main ways to do that is that the top award of some of the conflict cards that are going to happen in a round is to get a point with it. So it makes sense to go in there. But if you don't win the conflict, there are some other awards that'll come for other people too, for lower ranks in there. So that's cool too, because you are committing a lot. You may be committing your whole round of getting troops in there, and troops that you're not going to get back. Everybody loses their troops at the end of the conflict, regardless of whether you win or not. So it's risky, but there's a big payoff. And if you lose, you still get something for it. So I love all that stuff about the conflict. Second thing I really love about the conflict is that you know how many troops are in there. And every troop is worth 2 power. So that's cool. You have a pretty good picture going into the end of the round who's going to have the most strength in the conflict. But then you get the next phase of the conflict, which is the real reveal phase. And this can come at different times in the round for different players. But when somebody reveals, they might reveal some swords on the reveal phase. And that's going to increase their power. So all of a sudden, you might have somebody that's like 3 or 4 points in power down from the first place player, and all of a sudden they've just revealed 6 swords, and now they're up in the lead. So that's cool. So all of a sudden you get an exciting moment. And maybe a player who still has a worker left to place, now they can react to that, right? Because they now have a chance to do that. But then everybody's revealed, you know what the sword power is, let's go to conflict. Except now you've got these intrigue cards, these hidden cards that are in people's hands. Generally people aren't going to have more than 4 of them because that's risky. Those can have a variety of swords on them or other combat effects that happen during that time. So if you're committing all these troops and somebody's got 4 intrigue cards sitting across the table from you, it's a big risk. Because even if you win that, you're going to lose all the troops for it. So it's such a push and pull throughout the entire round of how many troops should I commit there? Hey, I'm going to get some troops. Should I leave them in my garrison or should I actually put them in the conflict because I think I'll get a prize for it? But if I put them out there and then somebody else comes in with more troops, maybe I won't get anything that's that valuable and I could save them for next round when I actually could get something. So many great decisions throughout that entire round. The whole game is driven by what's going to come out of those conflicts at the end of the round, even if you're not a part of it. And you're not going to be. Like, some rounds you're just going to stand out of the conflict. And that's another thing I love about it. This is a game where you can just ignore the conflict for major parts of the game and find other ways to win. But when you get involved in the conflict, when you commit to it, it can be such an exciting moment and such a tense moment. So Dune Imperium is my number one combat mechanism in a game. Do you guys consider Dune Imperium to be, do you consider that a combat? Like, would you actually have put this on your list, or does that not really fall within your definition of a combat?
I'm glad you brought that up, Tim. I was going to ask that if you were borderline at all about bringing this one in. It kind of blurs the line a little bit between almost like an auction and a combat. You're dedicating these resources to get this amount of swords. How much money, how much of this resource do you want to put towards winning this point or winning these couple points? And it's a bit of a push your luck, a bit of a like a blind auction almost. To answer your question, Tim, yeah, I do consider this a combat. But it's weird, it's different, right? It's cool. So I love this pick, and I love how it's done.
Before Chris answers, first of all, damn you for actually taking me out of the theme and calling that an auction, because now that you mentioned that, you're absolutely right. It 100% is an auction. Damn it. But it feels like a combat to me every time.
We talked about the theme last time, too. I think the theme is great on this, because I don't feel at all like I'm doing an auction. I don't even feel like it's worker placement. I feel like I'm putting this guy over here at this spot that's going to help me do some amazing things. So the more I think about the theme here too, I don't feel like I'm doing a worker placement auction game at all during the entire game. I think that speaks a lot to the theme.
Yeah, I'm with Adam on this one. And to answer your question, Tim, I do consider that a combat, and I thought about this one when I was coming up with my list. Although I was going to put it on my least favorite combat mechanisms. It's almost like combat for people who don't like combat.
Yes, exactly. That's why it's amazing.
And don't get me wrong, I like this game. If anybody who listened to our review of it, I think it's a terrific game. And I love the way that this fits into the game. And I think one of the things that's a real highlight of it, Tim, that you mentioned, is that it's not that devastating if you lose a combat. And so in that sense, like I said, it's combat for people who don't like combat. If you're looking for a big moment where there's a dramatic battle and a big outcome from it, this ain't going to be it. So it fits into the game, and I think it is a good part of the game. But when it comes to combat mechanisms, I don't know, it kind of bores me. And so I don't think it's a bad part of a game. I think it's a bad combat mechanism.
Oh, man. Oh, okay. So first of all, I almost put it as my third favorite just because I feel like it is so Yuri and almost not a conflict in a lot of ways. But to me, it is still so fun. So, Chris, you're just wrong on that. And it is impactful.
Sorry, man.
I mean, listen, I like conflict where it doesn't ruin your game, and it doesn't here, right? You can lose a conflict. You still get a bonus for it at the end. But you can commit a lot of your, previous turn's efforts. You could have put 8 or 9 troops in there, which would have taken you 2 or 3 worker placement actions to get there. That's like, I don't know, an eighth of your game to actually get to that point. And then all of a sudden somebody throws a couple intrigue cards out that they've been building up and planned for and prepped for, and you lost that. So it is very tense, and it is impactful enough, but not enough where it just takes you out of the game. And that's why I think it's a perfect, it's that perfect balance of being exciting and tense, but doesn't ruin the game if you can't pull it off.
It has the perfect balance of not being exciting or intense and having not that much impact, which makes it just like real battles, right?
Usually I'm trying to tune out Tim. This time I'm trying to tune out Chris. What is he saying over there? This is ridiculous.
I don't know.
The combat here is amazing. Those intrigue cards, I'm glad you brought that up, Tim. So the combats for me, mostly you know what's going to happen. There's a guy that's in first, and he's like way up there. I'm not going to challenge that. I'm going to be happy with my second place or my third place little couple spice that I'll get out of this. We don't talk about Bruno, but when 2 people are going after it, that first place thing, and this guy's got 3 intrigue cards and this guy's got 2 intrigue cards. What are they going to do? Oh my gosh, this is going to be great. Then that reveal comes out. The sword's marching up there. Oh my gosh, they're still so close. What's going to happen? First guy passes, second guy goes, next guy, boom. Then you have this like amazing conflict. He gets 3 points, she gets 2 points. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do now? I love it.
It's so good. I played a game on Saturday with some people, and we got into a conflict where I managed on my reveal phase to push my swords up to 12. And the next guy behind me was at 8. And this was a pretty exciting conflict. Like everybody was, I think there were 2 points up there, but in any case, it was a valuable conflict to win. And we get to the intrigue phase, and I pass because I was first player, and the other guy is like, pay 2 spice to get 5 swords. Pushes it right over my 12 to 13. I flip my card over. 2 spice, I've got an alliance, I get 7 swords because of what my intrigue card says. So he like committed everything. He committed 4 troops out there. He committed an intrigue card. He was 100% sure he was going to win that conflict. And I managed to pull it away from him because this card, I had to prep for it, right? I had to get an alliance. I had to hold it in my hand. It was amazing. So, Chris, so wrong on this one. This is by far the best combat mechanism.
I think Tim just loves it because of that one battle that he had. It's like the glory days. He'll be talking about this one when he's retired, and I remember that Battle of Arrakis.
No, I've gotten hit on it before too. I've lost some big combats because of this game too, and they hurt, but it's so good.
Glory days, Tim. They're gonna pass you by.
If Chris ever wins a single battle in this game, he'll see it. The light will come on.
Dude,
he'll have a complete 180.
Hold on. Once I got those dreadnoughts going, I didn't lose a single battle. I just didn't get them in there until Tim
Chris,
already won the game.
The game was over by the time you got the dreadnoughts going.
Right.
Let's move on. Adam, what's your number 1 combat mechanism of all time? And by the way, it's one that would have made my list, but Adam took it away from me. So
my number 1 combat mechanism is from Ankh. That's by Eric M. Lang, Simon Games. Also my game of the year for 2021, largely in part due to this combat situation in this game. The combat here is so amazing. It's so unique. First of all, it's an integral part of the game. Every part of this game is an integral part of every other part of this game. It's so iterative, and it's so recursive. There's so many parts that are wrapped inside these layers that have implications to the other layers. So I just love how it's put together. The combat occurs when this event marker reaches the combat icon on the track. So you can see it coming, first of all. You can predict if it's going to happen within 1 or 2 rounds. Okay, that player, he's going to trigger an event. And then a couple more, and that's going to trigger an event. So you can kind of plan for it, but not totally. So I love that aspect of it. Did I say it's going to happen 4 or 5 times during the game? That's how many times this icon is on the track. You might not even get to the 5th one. But each time the combat event triggers, you resolve in these territories, which could be, I think we started with 5 territories, but that goes up during the game. So maybe by the end, there's like 8 territories that are going to have these separate battles. And now you resolve them in order. So you're resolving territory 1 first. Maybe that has implications on what's going to happen in territory 3 or territory 4. Maybe you had some power that lets your god fly back home, or increases the power of these other temples. That now that combat in zone 5, where your god's next to this pyramid, he's going to be a mega power, and he's totally going to crush that force that thought they were going to take the victory. What else? I'm getting so excited here. So every time you see this thing approach on the event track too, it just builds up. Oh gosh, am I going to be ready? I have to hurry up and plan and get all my troops in position for all the things that want to happen. I didn't even talk about the combat cards yet, and the god powers. All these things wrap into the combat too. So maybe you can synergize this god power. All right, this one here in the 2nd tier. And oh man, I have this card that's letting me do some amazing stuff with this certain temple or this monument. I'm going to play that. All these things are going to wrap together. So much to think about. So many amazing scenarios that just pop out that you might not even realize. You'll have these sudden just moments of, oh my gosh, I can do this. I didn't even think about that. It's all, you can see it happening too. It's nothing random, nothing chaotic. It's a product of good planning and foresight if you're doing it right. And I think it just has the ability to feel so good and so amazing. I just want to go back to this game the more I think about it. Tim, you said you were thinking about putting this one on your list. What are your thoughts about the combat in Ankh?
Yeah, I wasn't even thinking about it. This probably would have been my number 2 right behind Dune Imperium. And then when we talked about our list and you had it on yours, I picked something else. So kind of moved my list around a little bit. This is a great combat mechanism. And in fact, it fires a couple other games for me as far as top combat mechanisms. I would have listed Kemet on my list because I think Kemet's combat is really fun. You know, the mind game of you go to conflict and then you reveal one of the cards. Everybody's got the same cards in their hand. But Ankh breaks that because the cards do things other than just direct points, right? Like they can have major effects that happen when you're revealing these cards. And sometimes maybe you're not getting as much combat power, but you're building a monument or you're causing a plague. They just do such cool effects. And I love that. And Chris, what was your number 3 today? What was the first one you mentioned?
It was Fractal, which had a lot of similarities with this.
Exactly. Yeah, and see, Fractal is very cool, but I still think that Ankh does it better. It's more streamlined. It's got more interesting, varied effects that are happening when it happens. Great. And one of the things I really like about Ankh too, which is different than some of the other big troops on a map games that we talk about, is that if I remember right, I think all of the troops, no matter what they are, whether it's the god or the smaller characters or whatever, they're all 1 point in base value. The base calculation you're doing is very simple, right? But it's the card that you play, and there are some other powers that you can get, but it's such a cool system and such a great conflict. And it has that big reveal, just like Dune, a game of conquest and diplomacy does. Both people have to decide, what's the other player going to do? I got to not only play my own game, but I got to play what are they thinking? But they are going to think that I'm thinking that, so I'm going to think that they're going to think this thing. Like, we're doing the whole Sicilian mind game here, and I love that with Ankh, and I think it does it better than any of the other games that we've talked about so far. So that is a great pick.
I just want to mention a couple of those cards. There's that Plague of Locust cards. It's kind of like one of those cards from Blood Rage that kills some of the other warriors before they even have a chance to fight. And then there's the card that lets you recall all the other cards back. Normally, once you play a card, it's gone. But maybe you threw your troop in zone 1 with no hope of winning the battle, just so you could play that recall card. And now for zone 2, 3, 4, 5, you're ready to go and have your deck all set up. It's just fantastic.
Yeah.
And unlike y'all's nonsense talk with Dune Imperium, I can't disagree with you on this one. The combat here is really cool. And one of the things you mentioned that I particularly liked about Adam was the way there's that track that marches toward the points where combat happens. And it's a heart-thumping moment because you see it coming, you know it's coming, and you got to get yourself ready. And I think that's really cool. It's a very nice combat mechanism here. But I'm not surprised because Eric Lang as a designer, has a very good sense of how to put together a good combat mechanism.
So, Chris, that seems like a perfect segue. What's your number 1 combat mechanism of all time?
Yeah. Well, unsurprisingly for anybody who's ever listened to this podcast before, my number 1 combat mechanism is, of course, the once and future king, Blood Rage. This game has it all. It is, so for those not familiar with the game, it is a very simple yet thorough combat mechanism where you have multiple troops amassed in an area, and each of them has a known value. And so there is the one factor in this is the known value of the troops on the board in that particular spot that are going to be entering the battle. But then there's the cards, and the cards are varied. They can be anything from +1, +6, +5 to the strength that you have in that zone, all the way to some bizarre things like 0 points added, but you get victory points if you lose the battle. Some cards let you cancel out the text of an opponent's card. Some cards let you destroy all of the opponent's figures in a battle except for one before you count the strength. The synergy of these cards and the way they fit like puzzle pieces with each other, you have these amazing situations where you throw down a card and you could be multiple points ahead and still lose that combat or win that combat. We talked about this last week, I think, but we played a game recently where Tim did a particularly nice job of playing these, and it was this amazing orchestra of moves that were being played, and there's so much strategy and so much mind games and excitement there. But at the same time, unlike Fractal, it's also quick and simple, and nobody's sitting there getting bored while the battle's taking place. If you're not involved in the battle, it takes a minute, everybody's throwing down a card, maybe 2 cards if you have a card that lets you throw down a second, and that's it. So it really is, I think, this perfect sweet spot of agency, complexity, and efficiency. And I think it is hard to argue that there is a game that has a better combat mechanism than Blood Rage. And I'm going to drop the mic there and stop.
Chris, I can't disagree with you here, and I'm going to just circle back to Ankh for a second. One thing that I think Blood Rage does much more interesting than Ankh does, as much as I love Ankh's varied and unique combat cards, all the players are drafting their cards at the beginning of the round. most likely you've seen what combat cards are going to be out there, but players don't have to draft them. And I think, what is it, 1 or 2 cards just get dropped at the end of the round. So in some cases, you're going to go into a conflict, and unlike Ankh, you don't know what cards they have in their hand based on what they've played before, because everybody's got the same starting ones. So you're playing a mind game, but you're playing a mind game with some missing information. And that's even more fun, because I can go to conflict with Chris and I know that +6 went around the board, but I also know the +0 that says you have to discard your card and he gets the glory for it, and then you have to play another card is sitting there. So do I play my +4 hoping that he draws it out of my hand, or that it's going to help me win the combat against the +6? I have no idea, but it's so exciting to go into that moment and not know what you're going to get. I think it does a really amazing job there. And it's quick, like you said, too. I all the things you said, Chris, you're absolutely right. Blood Rage is a fantastic and fun, epic moment of combat. The one last thing I'll mention, actually, about Blood Rage, which I think is pretty cool, is that when you go to conflict in an area in the board, you also have the opportunity to pull troops in, kind of like I talked about in Dwellings of Eldervale. But there's a limited number of spaces. So when you initiate a pillage in a space, there's a risk that somebody else is going to come in there. So you kind of have to take a chance in the game of, like, how much do I want to keep taking my actions to put guys in there and fill it in to make sure that somebody else can't come in there with too many other characters, versus just try to pillage as quickly as possible and hope that I can win a conflict against the one person that comes in. And then there's the exception of Yggdrasil, which is the big middle area, that if you go and pillage there, which of course has the most valuable treasures, people from any region in the board can come in there and attack it. And then you've got the areas where you've got boats that can drop in there next to your area, and it's next to 2 areas. It's so many cool things going on with Blood Rage. I absolutely love this game. It slightly beats out Ankh as far as Eric Lang's best combat mechanisms. Adam, let us hear your thoughts on this.
It's a tough choice, man. These games are fantastic. I think you can see a little bit of the DNA in Ankh that comes from Blood Rage, which I enjoy. The draft, Chris, is so cool. Like, you can't deny that. Inish has the same kind of draft, so those get compared a lot. I love that draft and being able to sync up your cards. Like you said, Tim, you get that little bit of information of what's out there, what's going around the table, and how are you going to be able to counter those if you don't take those cards. It's so cool. I'm so bad at it. It's so fantastic. The combat here, I can't argue with anything you guys said. It's just great.
All right, right on. So mention some really exciting combat mechanisms that we love playing in games. So we're going to go a little bit negative here and talk about some of our least favorite combat mechanisms. I think this is useful in the context of this conversation because, as Chris mentioned earlier on, in some games, the combat is what really drives the big moments in the game. It's, in some cases, it can make the game. It can, if there's a game that's got conflict in it, it's got combat in it, it can be the most exciting parts of the game. So we also had some games that we felt really missed the mark here and maybe ruined the game, or at least made that part of the game less exciting to us, and thought it was worth mentioning. I'm going to start here with a game that I actually think is quite awesome. It's not one of my favorite games because I think it's too long and it requires too many checks on the rule book, but that's Star Wars Rebellion. I am a huge Star Wars fan. I have been since I was like 10 years old, and I love this IP so much. And I think Star Wars Rebellion, as everybody knows, really brings the theme out. It tells an amazing story. It gives you the epic Star Wars, universe in a board game. But it's got some things going on there that just are not a great fit for me for a game experience. And probably the biggest culprit here is the combat mechanism. Before anyone contradicts me, yes, the expansion does help it a little bit. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. Maybe Adam's got some thoughts on that. But if you're talking about the base game in this, it's terrible. It's actually terrible, and it completely slows down the game. So here's how combat goes. There's going to be a conflict if there are units from both teams in a specific region there. And there can be units on the planet, and there can be units in space. At that point, both team members, if they have any left, they can put a leader into that space. And if that leader has any related indicators on it, for example, if it's a space leader, they could draw the combat cards equal to the markers that are on there. So what's going to happen is basically you're going to start going back and forth and rolling dice from space units, and then you're going to go to ground units. So the first players, they roll space units, and you could roll a handful of dice, a few units, based on the units you've got. So let's say you got a Star Destroyer and a TIE Fighter, and I'm attacking the Rebellion in there. That might let me roll 2 red dice and a black dice or something like that. I could roll those dice, they could all come up blanks. And then the rebellion would roll as well, and they might draw a shield, or they could roll something else. But it could be blank, and this happens a lot, right? So you might not get anything at all. But if you did roll something, maybe your leader then can play a tactics card, and the tactics card could say ignore that. So you ignore that, you're done with the space battle. Then you go to the ground battle, do the same thing down there. Your AT-AT walkers are fighting your snow speeders, and the snow speeder, gets a lucky hit and does 1 damage to the AT-AT walker. So you put a little marker on it. Then you go back to the space battle. And then you roll some more dice. Oh, you maybe missed that. You're going to do this like maybe 6, 7, 8 rounds of doing space battles, then ground battles and space battles and ground battles, playing these dumb tactics cards that are not very interesting at all. And then maybe somebody dies. And it's so boring, and it slows the whole game down. And I hate it. I hate it, and I don't want to play Star Wars Rebellion anymore because of the stupid combat in this game. So that's my number 2 least favorite. It's not even my least favorite, even after hearing all that. You would think that had to be the worst combat mechanisms ever made. For me, it's my second least favorite combat mechanism.
Tim, I can't really disagree with you. The fun part about this game is the cat and mouse, looking for the rebel base if you're the Empire, doing the missions if you're the Rebellion. The combat it slows it down, rolling dice back and forth, 1 hit, 2 hits, 3 hits, add them up. Okay, next round, now you roll, now I roll, tactic card, oh, now I get to re-roll some stuff. It is not the fun part of the game at all. So if there was a way to make that combat more streamlined, that'd be incredible. They tried to do it with the expansion. It helps, like you said.
A little bit,
A little bit. But it's still, it's not the fun part of the game. And it's sad.
Yeah, it makes the tactics cards a little bit more interesting, at least, because it's a tough decision. Because if you can play the tactics card that is relevant to your specific type of unit you have in there, then it gets a little bonus. But if you don't have that type of unit there and you need that specific tactic, then you're kind of giving it up. So it gives you an extra added decision, but it doesn't really make the combat more fun. Chris, do you remember? It's been a little while since you played it. What do you think about the combat in Star Wars Rebellion?
I'm with Adam on this one. I enjoy the game. The combat isn't the reason that I enjoy this game. It's not the highlight. It's a snoozer. It's frustrating and complicated. Fun game, but that's not where the strength is.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm glad you guys agree with me on that. That means you're right. Okay, Adam, what's your number 2 least favorite combat mechanism?
So this is Cthulhu Wars. That's by Sandy Peterson Games. For me, it's a little too chaotic. One of the things I'll go back to is that kind of variance. What do you think is going to happen versus the possibility and the likelihood of the possibility of what's actually going to happen? It's just, I feel like I have little to no agency. So that's one thing that bugs me. You got a handful of dice, you're chucking them all out there, same with the other guy, or maybe you only have 3 dice. I don't know. Anything could happen, I feel like. Another thing that kind of slightly bugs me is the map design. It's not readily apparent to me what's adjacent to what. I'll compare this with Ankh, where it's just a hex grid. Maybe that seems boring, but you know exactly who's next to who and who can move how far without having to be like, oh, does this go like this? Oh, and this part wraps around to this side of the board. So is that 3 spaces away or 2 spaces away? Does that matter for this bird guy that can fly in here anyway and crush me, or this Cthulhu guy that could pop up out of any space and then, all right, now there's a combat? The amount of things you have to keep track of and the way it's displayed, the more I think about it, the more the combat frustrates me, and just I think the game kind of frustrates me in general the more I think about it. Chris, I know you were thinking about having this one on your list, and I think it's one of your favorite games. What are your thoughts on the combat here and Cthulhu Wars in general?
It's definitely a game that I enjoy, but you're right. I mean, there's a lot of shortcomings in the combat. And combat's a pretty significant part of this. It's not all of it, and there's a lot of other complexities in the game, like your spell books and various things that I think add a lot of interest and a lot of strategy. But when it comes down to it, combat's really just a chuck of the dice. And it's not even like Eclipse, where you've got different dice that do different things, or strength. Really, the only variance here is how many dice do you get to throw. If you've got a big bad Cthulhu, you get to throw, 10 dice. If you've got a little Shoggoth, then you get to throw a dice or 2. One thing that I do think makes it a little bit more interesting is that it's not necessarily you lose the dice roll and everybody dies. You only die, I think, if you roll a 5 or a 6, or maybe it's even just a 6.
Yeah.
It's only a 6. And if you get hit with a 5 or a 4, I forget all the numbers, but basically they're kill hits, which take somebody out, and there are hits that make somebody retreat and move off of the space. So I think that makes it a little bit more interesting than just a straight dice chuck, but not a whole lot.
Yeah.
It's a fun game, but again, that's another one where the combat is not, it could have been a lot better.
Yeah, I agree. I think the game has some really interesting things going on. I think the one thing that I hate the most about the combat here is the pain rolls. So, like, you're rolling 6-sided die, and it could be a big handful of them, but only 6s are hits unless you have a special ability, which you could have any number of random special abilities. So my number one pain point with the combat is that everybody's got unique abilities, and you have no freaking idea what's going to happen when you go into combat unless you go and, like, memorize their board. So it's like half the time it's just chaotic and random, and that, like, he's got an ability that's face up on the board, but I'd have to, like, walk around the table and read what it is to actually know what I'm walking into in a combat. So that's a little bit annoying with the game. But I hate that you go to combat and you roll this, like, 10, let's say you roll 10 6-sided dice, and that can happen here for sure. And then you get 2 6s. So those are kills, but the opponent, the one who's losing the characters, gets to choose which ones are dying. So they're going to pick their lowest numbered characters, of course. And then any 4s or 5s are just pains. That means they just have to move out to other areas of the board. Usually not very impactful at all. There's obviously some reasons to have control of a region. But it's like you rolling 10 dice and maybe you killed one character. A few others move off. And then you've got, like, 1s through 3s that do absolutely nothing at all. I think that's what Adam said. It's a great point. It's that the variance range here is so huge. You can roll 10 dice, but because there's so little chance of actually having an actual impact, you don't really know what the odds are. And there have definitely been rolls where Chris and I are sitting there and he's got 10 dice and I've got 3, and we both have 3 characters in there, and he rolls all 1s and I roll 3 6s, and I just took out his, like, huge monster with my, little guys. And okay, so I mentioned similar type of thing in Dwellings of Eldervale, except in Dwellings of Eldervale, it's not a big deal if you lose a conflict. In this game, if you lose your Great Old One, it's going to end your game because it means you're going to have to spend an entire another turn to just get them back out on the board. And without them on the board, you're going to get walked all over by the other monsters. So if you lose a monster to like one of your Great Old Ones to a bad dice roll, you're probably out of the game. That's where, this type of combat really frustrates me. Good chase. All right, Chris, what's your number 2 least favorite combat mechanism?
My number 2 least favorite combat mechanism is a game that makes me sad to say this because it's a game that I really enjoy, and it's Scythe by Stonemaier Games. And it's one of those ones, it's sort of like Dune Imperium. I enjoy the game a lot, but the combat bores me to tears. The combat in this game is essentially based around cards, and similar to Blood Rage, there is an element of characters on the board, but it's minimal because really you only have a few actual characters that can engage in combat, and they don't necessarily bring a particular strength with them. They just give you the opportunity to play a card. So let's say I'm in a battle with Tim. We've each got one guy. That means we can each play one card. Plus you get to play, over the course of the game, one of the resources, so to speak, that you're generating is combat ability, combat strength. And you can spend up to, however much combat strength you have, up to a certain number. And then you can play one combat card for each of your combat characters. And the cards range from, I think, 2 to 5. And so you do this all in secret, and you have a little wheel, and you set it to a certain number, and then you add a card to it. And then there's a big reveal where you take it out and you show, and whoever has the higher number wins the combat. And frankly, I just find that so uninteresting that, I don't know, it bores me to tears. And it's not a bad game. It's a great game. I actually really enjoy the game, but the combat, I've always found it like I've dreaded going to combat because it just doesn't seem fun to me. And I can't describe it in any better terms than that.
So it was my understanding that this was kind of based on the Dune combat that you talked about earlier, Tim. So you've got this battle wheel, and you pick a leader in the Dune one, and you have these other cards, and you do that. But here, you're right, Chris, for some reason, this loses all the excitement that the Dune battle wheel had. It's just a number and maybe a couple cards, and you can see how much potential the other guy has by looking at their resource, their battle resource that's out there on the board, and it's just dull. It's kind of unfulfilling a little bit.
Yep.
So Tim, are you aware if it was based on that original Dune? And then what are your thoughts here too?
Yeah, I think it was. I think that's exactly what Jamie Stegmaier said. And I'll explain why this fails here, or why it doesn't work quite right, but also why it was a tough challenge, I think. I think the intent is to be a mostly deterministic combat, right? If you go into a conflict, you know how much power you have, you know how much power the other has. You know what the max card they could have is a 5, right? There's a 2, 3, 4, and 5 point combat cards. You know how many they have, how many cards they have, how many combat cards they have, and then you know what the likelihood of them having one of those. But if you basically go into any combat expecting they might have a 5, you should know who's going to win the conflict. And the reason why you would do deterministic combat in a game like this is because it is a resource management game that takes time to build up your engine and collect your resources and, basically do all of your actions. So if the game was just full of conflict, you could basically spend 3 turns building up your engine and moving around the board to kind of build what you're trying to do. And then you have a bad luck conflict, and then all of a sudden you've just lost everything you've just built. You don't want to do that. So Voidfall is a great example where they tried to answer the same question and said, we're going to take all the variance out of it and just make it completely deterministic. I don't think that's particularly fun either, but on the other hand, you just go into it knowing that you're not going to have any decision to make there. The problem with Scythe is that it makes it a mostly deterministic combat, but you're still playing a very uninteresting mind game with the person across from you. And that is that if you commit to everything that you could go in there with, then you're going to give up all that power. It means you're going to be more likely to get slaughtered at the next combat. And the other person has to know that. So they might say, well, I'm going to go all in, even though I know I'm going to lose, because if they don't want to commit all their stuff, then I might win. So there's a little bit of a mind game there to play. And sometimes it can result in a surprise. The problem with it is that the reason you don't want random combat, you want it deterministic, is to not ruin somebody's game. But if the attacker then goes in and makes the one decision that might be smart for them, which is to not commit all their resources, and the other person wins, now that person kind of randomly just lost all of that power and is now going to be in a bad situation in the game. So nobody comes out happy out of those conflicts. Anytime you go into a conflict, which is not a major part of the game, but it can be an important and impactful part of the game, it's going to leave you unhappy. Almost always, right? Either you've just completely set your engine back, or even if you're the winner, you go into the conflict, you win, you get one of those stars, you've now given up all your power, which now sets you up to get attacked by somebody else. So Chris, I totally agree with you. This game is so interesting and always a fun time for me, but the conflict is always the least fun part of it, I think. And I don't know how to answer that. I honestly think if the combat cards had some variety of kind of slightly unique, interesting decisions on it, like Ankh does, like Fractal does, to kind of make it at least a little bit more of an interesting puzzle than just, do they have a 2 or a 5 in their hand? And I'm going to take the risk with that. There's a risk to doing that, but I think it would have been more fun that way. So, yeah, a lot of thoughts there, but I agree with you. It's an unfortunate part of that game.
Yeah, Tim, you're right. The more I think about that win or lose, you don't feel good about it. That's not fun. You have a combat. If you win, you feel bad. If you lose, you feel even worse. That's just weird. That's not good.
I mean, in that sense, maybe it's sort of like a real war. Nobody feels good about it.
Yeah, and I think that's what the game is trying to do, right? It's trying to be a Cold War game where conflict is always a risky proposition. And so you don't want to go and get into conflict all the time because it's going to set you up for risk. It's going to set you up for attack. And you can play that game without any conflict at all. But you can also play Eclipse Second Dawn for the Galaxy without any conflict at all. And we've done it before, and it's a lot less fun when you do that.
Right.
Well, I thought in Scythe, you get, as part of the in-game criteria, you have to go into a certain amount of combats to get your stars out. Is that true? Or you have to win
You
combats?
can get stars, but you can get stars, and you can get your 6 stars in completely different ways.
Okay.
So you could end the game without having any conflicts at all.
But typically you can get up to 2 stars.
You can get 2 that way.
Is that right?
Yeah.
2 separate combats?
Yeah. So it's potentially lucrative. And there's also the thing with the conflict there, which isn't necessarily a conflict, where if you walk into a place with people's workers, then you're gonna lose popularity, right? But that also can be a little bit negative in that, yes, it's risky to do that, but you can completely set my engine back and all the work I did to put people out around the board, and then maybe you're not even using popularity as your end game condition. It's an interesting push and pull there, but definitely as a conflict mechanism or combat mechanisms, it's not very fun. I'm going to talk about my least favorite combat mechanism, and this is Root by Leader Games. We reviewed Root recently, and I'm not a huge fan of the game anyway. I think it has some very interesting things going on. I love what they are trying to do here and the theme of the game. But I think one of the things that really puts me off of the game is that this is a game full of conflict, and the conflict is very dull and very uninteresting and very unnecessarily complicated. And I'm going to explain it to you even after just rereading the rulebook today, and I'm still probably going to get it wrong because it's completely unnecessarily complicated, which I just mentioned. So you go into a conflict with another character in the game, and basically you roll 2 dice. I think they're 8-sided dice or maybe they're 6-sided dice, but you roll 2 dice, the person who goes into the conflict. And the person who started the conflict gets the higher number dice, and the person who was the defender in the conflict gets the lower number dice. And then I think if you have that number of characters of the dice number that you rolled, then you can do that much damage to the other person. Something like that. It takes way too much brain power to kind of calculate through that decision, which is essentially would be probably just as useful to just say, I started a conflict, I have more power than you, take 1 thing off the board. Or roll 1 dice and say it's a 0, 1, or 2 in there, which is how many pieces you're going to take off the board. It just could have been more streamlined, and just as a conflict, it's never fun. It's never that interesting. You know that you're going to lose 0 to 2 people if you're the defender in a conflict. The other person, do they lose somebody? I don't even remember if the attacker loses anybody. Anyway, I just know that I never had any fun attacking en route or defending en route, and one of my least favorite parts about that game. What do you guys think about the conflict en route?
I don't disagree with you that it's not a great combat mechanism, but I do disagree that it was that complicated, because it was probably one of the least complicated combat mechanisms I can think of. You roll 2 or 3 dice, the winner takes the higher dice, and
it's always 2 dice. It's always 2. But Chris, here's the deal, right? Like, go check the rule book on that and watch the number of different points in the rule book you have the steps through to follow through on that.
Yeah, so. I don't think so. I think it's pretty safe. It's dull. It's dull, okay. But it's simple. I mean, I did not find that complicated. So, like I said, I don't disagree with your overall premise there. I just disagree on the details of it.
And again, I didn't say it was complicated. I said it was unnecessarily complicated, and that it is not an interesting. No, listen. There's a distinction.
What does that distinction
mean? There, because you actually made me think about something that wasn't an interesting choice to have to go through the process on that, and I think that's the key problem with it. I really think it could have just been deterministic. I attack you, I've got more power. You lose 1 thing, or you lose 2 things, or whatever the difference is there. You didn't even need to have dice you didn't need to have a table of decisions to go through there, and that's I think the biggest sin for the root combat mechanism.
So we're arguing not about whether it's good or bad, but why it's bad. Is that right?
That's the whole conversation. That's why we're having this whole podcast episode, Chris.
Yeah, Tim, the combat en route is just unfulfilling, unsatisfying. I don't know what it is. There's just like too many steps in the rule book for what should just be roll this dice, take 2 off or 1 off, and do I lose something? I don't know. I still don't know what it is.
Exactly, so. Right? Chris doesn't even know if it's 2 or 3 dice, and he's played the game several times.
Yeah. Now I'm gonna let me step to Root's defense a little bit. I actually have played that game on the app some, where the computer takes care of a lot of the details, and so I actually think I enjoy Root more now than I did when we played it on our game. So, but again, I don't disagree that combat is not the highlight of that. It is a pretty significant feature, though. So it's an understandable thing that you'd expect it to be more exciting. But there are interesting tactical choices and interesting strategic choices that you're making. They just don't play out in the term of exciting combat.
Yeah, and you probably like it more now because on the app you don't have to track all the crazy steps of the combat that you have to go through.
That is true. There's not that many steps. It's 1 step. You roll a couple dice. All
right, Adam.
Anyway,
Adam, what's your least favorite combat mechanism in board games?
Other than Root.
My least favorite, and we've given this game a lot of heat on the show, it's Path of Light and Shadow. That's Travis Archant's and Indie Boards and Cards. Tim, we've talked about this a few times. The game is a little lackluster, and a lot of that is because of the combat. It seems like an interesting game. It's kind of a one dude on a map. You're marching around this territory, trying to rally people to your side or conquer these other territories, whatever you're trying to do. But it falls so flat. And here's how the combat goes. So in order to take control of a province, you have to conquer it, and that also ruins it. We'll get to what ruins means here in a little bit. If that region's uncontrolled, we'll just talk about the uncontrolled scenario. You can also go against another province that's controlled by another player. But in uncontrolled, you play one or more cards for their strength value. Then you roll the number of attack dice equal to the card that you played that had that highest attack value. You add up your total strength there from whatever you get on the roll, whatever other cards you played. It's just a little icon on the cards that says 3 swords or 2 swords or whatever. And then you do any modifiers. So maybe you have some rerolls. What do you do? Okay, and now if your total strength is greater than the defense of that province, then you get to conquer it. Odds are you won't conquer it on the first time. Maybe you did it right. Maybe you're smarter than me, which isn't saying much when you're playing this game. Maybe you get to conquer it right away. But if you don't, then you're taking off these little sections of a wall or a barrier on each province equal to the number of ruin icons that you rolled on these dice. Incidentally, these sections of wall or whatever they are on every province might be the worst component in all of board games. They're not smooth. They don't feel good. They're not heavy. They don't quite stack right. They frustratingly just, it seems like they should stack perfect. They're kind of squarish, but they don't stack right. They're like slightly off in the most frustrating kind of way. Anyway, and they're sharp. They like cut your hands. They don't feel good at all. They're horrible. They're gray. Anyway, that's beside the point. Maybe you get to ruin this thing, and what are you going to do next time? You're probably going to try to attack again if you didn't conquer it, because you don't want to just not conquer it after marching around the map for 2 turns. So you're going to try again. Oh, I didn't conquer it again. Oh man, now what am I guess I have to sit here again and do it. So now you just spend all this time trying to conquer this territory, do some stuff, and then your leader's going to march somewhere else and try to do the same thing. It is so dull and so tedious. It's horrible. Tim, back me up on this.
I hate everything you just said. I hate that mechanism, and it's not even in the top 3 least favorite mechanisms for that game for me. Chris, what's your least favorite combat mechanism of all time?
Oh boy. Okay. Man, so this was a true scraping the bottom of the barrel moment. But the worst of the worst in combat mechanisms is Risk Legacy. Now, I'm almost cheating here because this is the same combat mechanism as in the original board game Risk. I feel like I can squeeze it in because there's Risk Legacy, which has some true modern board gaming cred. In fact, it was the first Legacy game. But I almost want to talk about this more as a concept than as an actual game. And it really is, for anybody, I mean, everybody who's listening to this has probably played Risk at some point or another. And it just comes down to an attacker rolls a certain number of dice, usually 3. A defender rolls a certain number of dice, usually 1 or 2. And for every number, you compare dice, and for every number that's higher, that person loses a combatant. And it is this ugly slog of rolling dice over and over and over again, losing 1 or 2 guys each time in the midst of a combat. And the reason I wanted to talk about this was because it really highlights all the worst things about dice-based combat, where there is no strategy, there is no tactical decision to be made. It is just rolling dice. And your fate lives 100% on what those dice end up rolling. And it's not even like you can in Eclipse where you can build your ships up so they do certain things. It's not like Cthulhu Wars where you can add enough guys to the battle that you can throw this big handful of dice and maybe win a bunch of stuff. It is just dice, the same small dice roll after dice roll. And here is actually a perfect example of why this is absolutely a miserable way to do combat. And it's something that we've talked about recently quite a bit. And that is the bad feeling that comes from unfortunate dice rolls. So I started playing this game, a campaign with my family, which includes my 10-year-old son. And we got 3 or 4 games in, and we were kind of doing, we were kind of borderline on some of them because of this thing I'm about to talk about. But we got to our last game that we played, and we threw handful after handful of dice, and my son was attacking me, and he wanted so badly to kill me, and he had like 50 guys on his territory, and he just kept rolling one after one after one after one, to the point where by the end of it, he was nearly in tears because he was so frustrated and so angry because he should have won that battle, and he didn't because he had horrible luck. And I mean, that's an extreme example, but it really does go to why this is so unsatisfying. That there's almost no strategy. It's not fun. One of the reasons why we like modern board games is because we've reduced in a lot of ways the luck that goes into the games, and we've increased the strategy and the thoughtfulness that goes into the turns you take. And dice-based combat really, without some kind of a modification like Eclipse does, or even Cthulhu Wars, is just unfortunate and really creates bad feelings and an incredibly unsatisfying way of resolving a conflict. And so this is a good example of how bad it can get, but in a sense, a lot of these same issues translate to a lot of dice-based combat.
Chris, does the Risk Legacy game still have the thing where the attacker can roll up to 3 dice if they have 3 troops, and then the defender can roll a max of 2 dice? Is that how it works?
It's identical, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And it's funny that you mentioned that. My dad was a big fan of Risk. You know, when I was in my late teens and early 20s, we played a lot of kind of family game nights, and it was a lot of Risk. And we had a lot of fun with it. You know, at the time, it's kind of what we knew as a big epic game to have fun with. But even in my early 20s, I think I was nearly in tears a couple times when I would go into a conflict with 20 troops in a combat, and my dad's got 3, and he manages to hold me off. Sometimes it's going to happen, and it's so freaking annoying. You can't do anything about it. You can't mitigate it. So, yeah, totally get it. Sorry for Nathan to have to go through that with you. But
I wonder how many people's dads have tried to play this game with them. And over the years, how many people have just been totally turned off to any other board game because of the damage a Risk type game has done to them? Isn't that sad to think about? Like, it's a horrible mechanic.
One thing that I should add that I didn't, but that game was so bad that we said, we're not going to do this anymore. It's not worth it. That level of stress, that level of unhappiness and discomfort, especially for a kid, why would we do it? Why subject them to it? Why subject us to it? I mean, it's just not fun.
It's weird how popular it used to be, and that used to be like the fun thing. Like, roll these dice, have these crazy swings. So it's interesting to see how gaming has evolved since then.
you know what else Risk has in it? Set collection. Do you guys have any other thoughts on conflict in games? Because we wrapped up our list here. There's one group of games that I left off my list. You know, I don't know if they would have all made it, but they would have at least been in contention for it. And that's games where the conflict is against the game itself versus against other players. So I didn't include those in my game, as I mentioned. The 3 games that I probably would have at least considered for my list were AuZtralia, which I thought had a really interesting card flip that had some different variants depending on the type of units in the combat. Mage Knight, which has a very, very complex and overwrought system for how to beat a conflict there. Painful, stressful, but really, really rewarding when you can actually pull it off. And then Cthulhu Death May Die, which I think has a nice push and pull between dice rolls, but also that if you get sanity rolls, then that can actually hurt you, but it can also help you grow your engine, give you new powers, but puts you at risk of losing the game because of it. So I like a lot of what Cthulhu Death May Die does with the random dice roll. But those were all co-op games or games against the game itself, or combats against the game itself. And the one last one that I really struggled to not put on my list and probably deserved to be there, but I know most people don't consider it a modern hobby board game, and that's Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering has one of the most fun and interesting and deep combat and conflict mechanisms that I won't go into a lot of detail here, but I think it's worth a mention. It still holds up 25 years and it's still a great combat mechanisms. What about you guys? Any other final thoughts on combat?
Well, along those lines, I was going to ask Chris and you, Tim, what you guys think about the combat in something like Star Realms, where it's a deck builder. You're building up these ships that have this attack thing. You're trying to attrition the other guy, get his combat down to 0 before you lose all of your combat. Did you guys give any consideration to Star Realms or other deck builders?
I think it's actually kind of similar to Magic the Gathering. I know Magic the Gathering is a lot more interesting, has a lot more going on, but it's very similar, and I think partly why I left it off the list is that is the game. I mean, basically the life of the other person is the resource that you're basically going after. So it doesn't really feel like combat as much as it just feels like kind of playing the game.
Right.
And I think that's why it's hard to fit it on this list. I love Star Realms though. So.
Yeah, I agree with what Tim just said. It's hard to separate that out as a combat mechanism, but it certainly was something I thought about when I made my list, and it's a game I love.
Yeah. All right. Well, a couple games I wanted to mention. I'll start with a game called Maria. This is a game, it's by Richard Savelle, the publisher's Histo game. So this is the game, I've heard of it, and the theme wouldn't normally interest me. It's based on the War of Austrian Succession, where Austria was attacked by Prussia, France, Bavaria, and Saxony. So what you have is these 3 leaders, each in charge of one or more of those groups of armies. It's only a 3-player game. In basic terms, one person is in charge of kind of a homogenous army, just one group of people. The next person is in charge of an army that composed of 2 sort of separate allies. And then the third leader has, I believe, 3 separate armies, one of which is allied with the first player, and the other group is allied with the second player. You jump in the rule book and it says, don't worry about it. This is all going to work out. It sounds crazy. This is all going to work out. It says something to that effect in the rule book. This game plays out more, so it's divided into a grid. It has all these roads composed over this grid, this map of the area. And there's all these cities, your generals are moving around. Every time 2 separate generals are adjacent, that's when this conflict arises. And so we have this hand management element that steps in. You have to have suited traditional deck of card suits: clubs, spades, hearts, and diamonds. So if your general's in a diamond region, you have to play with a diamond suit from your hand. And you could be fighting across a border. So one general could be in a diamond region, another general could be in a club region, or it could be in the same region. So it's clubs versus clubs. So there's an element of knowing what suit of cards the other players might have. Or if you know you're high in diamonds, you're going to stick to the grids that have high in diamonds. I've heard so much about this game. I heard the combat is so interesting. I'd love to try it. I don't know if I ever will. But that's Maria. Have you guys ever heard of this game?
No, but when you mentioned the name, I was really hoping that this was a game about the West Side Story, and I could break into song in the middle of it. But no, I'd never heard of it. The board looks like a kind of a traditional war game, but it does have some really interesting things going on.
Yeah, just looking at it, I can't imagine a game that looks less appealing.
Yeah.
Honestly.
It's supposed to be pretty amazing. I'd love to try it someday. Another one I've thought about. Do I want to try it? I don't know. It sounds interesting. This one's called Forbidden Stars. That's an older Fantasy Flight game, area control. I think it involves these kind of stacking of chips, and then those get resolved in order during the combat phase. So you kind of pre-program what's going to happen, and then there's a reveal there that's supposed to be pretty exciting, but I've never played the game. Have you guys tried this or heard of that?
I haven't. I've heard of it, and it sounds really cool. One of the things I have a concern about is that I understand that the conflict, like some of the other games we've mentioned, can go on a long time between the 2 people that are involved in the conflict and the people that are not involved are just kind of sitting on the sidelines. So I think it could be really fun for the people engaged and not fun for the people that aren't. This game will never be reprinted because this is a Warhammer IP that Fantasy Flight used to do games for, and they don't do them anymore. But Fantasy Flight has taken some of their old IP games and kind of revisited them. So maybe we'll see a modern, kind of retelling of Forbidden Stars at some point.
The designer pops up on Board Game Geek every once in a while talking about his re-theme for the game as well.
Nice.
So it may come back in some different form.
Yeah, I've heard enough good stuff about it. Maybe it's not the right game for me, but I'd love to give it a shot at some point.
Right.
Well, that was a really great conversation, you guys. Thanks for hanging out and chatting about combat. I'm glad we didn't fight too much over that. I do want to mention before we wrap up, as I have been recently, if you like the show, come out and hang out with us on Twitter. You can find us at BG_hot takes. We're all pretty active on there, so we'll be happy to chat with you. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What were some of your favorite combat mechanisms? What are some that you think we got wrong? If you enjoy the show, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. We'd really appreciate that. It's always great. Kind of reminds us that people are listening, so we want to keep doing it. Also, it'll help other people find the show. I do have another listener that left us a review this week. This is on Canadian Apple Podcasts, so I managed to locate this. I don't always get the ones out of country. This was left by Arthur. The title was Great Range, and he said, "Great and diverse reviews, honest, insightful, and funny. Good-natured team, equal voices." When I read that, I had this great dopamine hit. And then I read his next line and it said, I would consider paying them to stop saying dopamine hit. So then my serotonin picked up and I got a little depressed. No, I'm just kidding. Artur, listen, we heard you, man. I apologize. That was probably on me, and I probably overused some terms occasionally, but I'll keep a check on that. Very cheeky. Thanks for the review, though, and thanks for leaving us 5 stars, even if we're bugging you sometimes.
And I think in the future we'll replace that with cognitive dissonance.
Anyway, yeah, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts if you can. Very helpful for the show. And also tell your friends about us and tell your game groups. And if you're on online platforms and people are asking about podcast recommendations, mention us, because that's a great way for people to listen to us and for us to build a little bit more of a community here. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Until next week, take care.
Have a good night, all.
Bye-bye.